Thanks for joining this morning, everybody. I'm Jake Andrle, Legend Lead Sales Agronomist. Today we're going to go over some things on supersizing your silage program. Kind of some management strategies just for maximum output. We'll talk about some things fertility-based and some considerations. Just with recent things, there's been a lot of questions on fertility and fertilizer and what do I do, what do I don't do. Things like that. Talk about our silage program on the seed side, some things that you can tweak there, and then we'll round it out with any questions. All right, so this is kind of just a slide, just kind of real brief on how we select products or kind of throughout the year on the silage stuff. So pick anywhere on that wheel. This is kind of, I call it my hamster wheel. This is what all the agronomists go through all season long to bring the best silage products forward. But it really kind of starts off with like this time of year would be that EXP hybrids, plot locations. We've kind of already got all that stuff baked and all that stuff figured out. Then we go into plot planting. We take notes throughout the season, look at these products, evaluate them on emergence, those kind of things. As they get, as we get in further into the season, flower timings, leaf disease, stalk, root ratings, all of that stuff. And then the silage harvesting, collecting all the data. That's a kind of a little bit of a labor intensive practice, going in and hand harvesting stuff based on quality. But what we do is we go in and pull essentially 12 plants per entry of the plots that we're looking at. We grind up a representative 3. So we weigh the 12, take 3 out, grind those 3 up that are kind of representative of that sample size we took, and then send that in for quality testing. And when we do our silage testing, I mean, the tonnage definitely matters. So we're not looking to try to, like when we do our silage testing, when I send that data out, we aren't necessarily looking for, I'm not worried if something might be a 1/10 of a ton off or a 1/4 ton off because of the small sample size. The tonnage can be achieved through a lot of things like fertility management, population. There's a lot of factors that go into that. You can get pretty high tonning corn silage out of a lot of the genetics that are out there today. What we're really looking for, and the one thing that you really have a hard time tweaking, is the quality side. So on the testing side, that's really what we're looking for. If something is a good tunning or a high tunning product, it's going to sort towards the top in the data set. If it's poor tunning, vice versa. But I'm not looking at if something out tons something by a 1/4 ton that it's going to be, it's not going to be 10 ton when we get it in the field. But it gives us a good representation. So then we do the genetic plot tours and evaluations, kind of truth checking what we saw in our silage harvest. We ferment those samples for 30 days, so we don't really know what those results are. We go and evaluate everything from genetic suppliers, and then the grain plot harvest side, we take that obviously, and then go through our selection process that we do every year. So it's kind of a whole year approach to how we bring these new silage products forward. So I kind of went through this, but I'll real brief touch on this. So the EXPs, the one thing, like, as you guys are on the dealer side and even some of the account managers are on the call, when we have EXPs come out into plots this year, we will send at least a minimum of 1 to 2 silage samples in of every EXP. Even if a genetic supplier tells us, yep, it's only 6 foot tall and it's a grain only hybrid, and it'll never make corn silage. Not that we like to prove people wrong, but there's been a lot of situations where we have tested stuff that genetic suppliers have told us would not make good corn silage, and they've actually been our best testing products and some of our mainstays on the silage side. If anybody knows 5101 or 9101 Smart Stack, that family on the corn silage side for digestibility, tonnage, starch content, I mean, you name the metric, that has been one of our top testing products for corn silage. And that product first came out as an EXP. We were told that it was medium plant height, would never make corn silage, wasn't going to ton at anything. We've got multiple farms, at least over here in Wisconsin, that run 30 to 35 ton corn silage of that product. So we kind of truth check some of the suppliers, and just being real, there's not nearly as much effort into silage breeding today as there was 15, 20 years ago. That's kind of just like anything in ag. A lot of things are getting streamlined and pigeonholed down, where not that the genetics aren't there, it's just nobody is exploring them. And so we kind of go through and truth check and, do the groundwork on figuring out what does work and what doesn't. So the other thing is also selecting stuff east versus west. there's a lot of different, hybrids that work over here don't necessarily work in Western South Dakota and vice versa. So we do evaluate and bring those products out for each geography. We'll talk about the difference east versus west on some of the other stuff here coming up. Okay, so this is one thing as I get into the meat of everything is not every silage need is created equal. So if I'm on a dairy farm in western Wisconsin where I personally live, what a guy values in corn silage is going to be different than somebody that's up by Foley, Minnesota. That's different than like you get by Morris, Minnesota, and it's different than when you get into the Dakotas and the 29 corridor. Everybody is going to value silage differently and what they like in that silage or what's their most important quality, I guess you could say. And it can be as literally two guys living across the road from one another have completely different views on what they value with corn silage. So we take that all into account. So there's a lot of influencing factors. This is one I commonly see is limited acre base guys that are renting a lot of land, don't have the acre base or the animal units are on the farm. Those guys are usually caring about tonnage. Generally, when you get to the west, I'm seeing that, as where especially guys are selling silage to large dairies, tonnage is at the forefront. Tonnage doesn't always make the best silage though, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. But so low percentage corn silage diet, those guys are looking for starch content. Say if we're feeding a lot of haylage, a lot of other forages, there's not a lot of energy in that ration, so we got to get it from somewhere. And even though corn, well, today it's not cheap, it's going up a little bit, but corn is still relatively cheap out there. But guys, still, it's an expense on the farm. They don't like to buy it if they don't have to. So then, corn or the starch that's in that, or the overall corn that's in that silage is what is really driving what they consider high quality. So a high percentage corn silage diet, these are the guys that have 1,000 acres and they're ripping 900 of it for corn silage. And then they have a little bit of flex here and there. Kind of goes with those, usually the limited acre based guys are this way too. They're looking at fiber digestibility because you've got to have the most digestible fiber with these cattle. You can only pack so much into them. So every ounce of what you're putting into them has to be digestible. So that's something like in Wisconsin in general, a lot of guys are moving towards more of a heavy corn silage diet. So we're seeing fiber digestibility every single year, even, and it's always been important, but every single year it seems like it's more and more important to guys. A guy feeding heifers and dry cows, those kind of things, they don't care about the starch content. They don't necessarily care about the fiber digestibility either so much. They might care, but it's not at the forefront. They're actually looking for lower starch content. They don't want those animals to get too fat. They don't want to be feeding them too much energy. They just want a lot of essentially filler, if you will. And then like if you're finishing steers, those kind of things, tonnage matters, and then high starch content, the less corn you have to add into that ration. So everybody's view on silage based on the farm is different. Okay, so I'm just going to break this into three categories essentially in our lineup. And you guys are like, Jake, you haven't talked about anything on maximizing my silage, and we'll get there. But I just want to lay this framework out before I dive into the rest of this stuff. So we have three camps of silage in our lineup today, okay? So the first one I'm going to talk about is actually on the far right, would be our dual purpose hybrids. So these are hybrids that get a little green DP logo. And what dual purpose means is they're hybrids that you can combine as well as chop. They're very flexible products. We see a big push of guys that are using dual purpose products in dairies all over the upper Midwest today. And it's just really that flexibility. A lot of guys, they don't have the flexibility of having all perfect ground. Maybe we got some really dry, sandy light stuff and some really heavy wet stuff. And when the chopper shows up, we might not be able to drive on the wet fields, and maybe our sand fields are burned up by then. And they really need the flexibility to be able to turn that chopper whichever way out of the driveway and go take corn silage off. And that's why we see that flexibility. It's kind of like a cheap insurance policy that you're going to be able to put up some sort of high quality feed somewhere on the farm. So now those products a lot of times have very good quality. They have the quality aspects, the tonnage aspects, but those are products that are meant for grain production first. Okay. So I always said, and the guys that know Dan Matzik when he was here Dan Matzik always said, you can make corn silage out of anything. Anything can be corn silage. And there's some truth to that. If you want to run a chopper through a 4-foot tall, can of maize corn, you can make corn silage. But the dual purpose hybrids are selected based on their grain characteristics first. their silage second. So the silage is just an added benefit. A lot of guys see that and they think that a grain hybrid or a dual purpose, oh, it's not, I'm a grain farmer, I don't, dual purpose doesn't mean that, you know, it's for me. That's completely not true. The dual purpose hybrids still, I mean, some of our best grain hybrids on the market today are dual purpose products in the product guide. So then we move over to our leafy and leafy flowery. So these are silage specific products, okay? So these are products that are never intended to be combined. If you ever sell these or have these on your farm, if you try to go rip, I don't care what combine you have, how good of a job it does, you will be calling me, you'll be calling Steve Ressler, your agronomist. You will not be happy. They do not shell, they do not dry down. They are meant for silage. In the silage space, they're terrific products. The one thing is they are more geared towards the tonnage side of things than they are the quality side of things. If you're looking to put up a mountain of feed and a lot of tonnage with good starch quality, high starch digestibility, but not necessarily worried about the fiber content side of things, the leafies and the leafy flowery hybrids are a great option. And we have a lineup of those. We're still looking at evaluating a few new things there possibly for the future, this coming year. But that's kind of what they are. Now, everybody, when they hear the word silage, they open a Legend product guide today. A lot of guys gravitate right towards those and see those as the only products that we have. And there's definitely a big fit, especially out west in the Dakotas and parts of Minnesota. And even in Wisconsin, we have a strong following on a few products there too. But these are products that are the guys that are feeding a high corn silage diet on a dairy. They're going to start to deal with some fiber digestibility. I wouldn't say issues, but you're not going to have the quality you will out of some of our very high quality dual purpose stuff. So, and what those would be, so the silage first. And so this is kind of something, we'll always carry the leafies. We'll always have the leafy floweries. We started down this road back in 2023 or 4. I can't remember which year, the silage first products. So what those products are is those are products that are identified as, yes, you can combine them, but they're intended for silage use. That's like I shouldn't say intended for. The quality aspects of them put them on a pedestal above every other dual purpose out there, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like the playoff teams or the playoff hybrids of the dual purposes, if that makes sense. So what those are is they're meeting a minimum requirement of at least being able to achieve a 60 NDFD 30, whether it's through management or just genetically on its own. It has to be able to hit that. It has to maintain a 35 starch level in sampling. A 30 starch isn't a bad number on starch, but a high starch number of 35 has to be able to achieve a UNDF 240, so the undigested fiber. Has to be able to hit below 10 on that. Most guys are shooting 10 and a half is like their max of what they want to see. A lot of our silage first stuff ends up at 9 and a half. So and that kind of separates itself. To give an idea on a leafy or the leafy floweries, oftentimes those come back at 13 to 15 on a UNDF 240. So just a little bit of difference there. And then obviously has to have the tonnage, has to check that box, has to be agronomically solid and everything. So when people open that Legend product guide up, a lot of guys will only gravitate to leafies because they just see silage on it. That's the first thing they see. A lot of times, often some of our best silage products fall into that silage first camp, especially for dairy quality feed. So this is a really busy slide. So this is where we get into some of the management stuff. So population considerations. So this is something that we've had guys, with the economics and milk prices aren't great, and the corn and bean prices climbed here just a little bit in the recent couple days. But everybody's looking on where can I cut, where can I increase, where can I decrease, how do I change my program to get the most out of every acre. So this is kind of my general recommendations. I put and I'm not picking on you, Maria, but I put the Maria disclaimer on every single one of these. So I realize that some areas like in the Western Dakotas, we're not planting at 30,000 for corn silage or grain or anything ever because the environment doesn't allow it. But this is generally the population ranges of what I'm going to recommend. So on our leafy floweries, 28 to 30,000, and 30,000 is an absolute hard stop maximum. I would not recommend planting them ever over 30. I've had guys put them at 32, 34, thinking they're going to gain tonnage. The leafy products want to have all the room in the world. They're kind of called like space hogs that way. The less population you give them, the bigger that ear will flex out and the bigger and more robust that plant will get. And that's why keeping that population at that 20,000, I would rather have them at 26 than I would at 30, even in a high fertility, high yield situation. Say we're in southern Minnesota, I would rather have them at 26 rather than 30. And I know, like, you get out west where Maria and Ryan are up in North Dakota, and even some of the stuff in South Dakota, we got guys dropping these leafies at 18 to 24,000 for corn silage. So don't be afraid to go on the low side of things there, but that you will lose quality drastically, and you will actually lose tonnage when you pass 30 to 32,000. You'll actually go back the other way. It's not more is more. It's if the more you plant, the less you'll get with a leafy. So the dual purpose type products are just the straight up DPs. Kind of give it a big range here, 30 to 36. Once again, realize the Dakotas aren't that high. That's kind of where you're going to find your best balance of quality and tonnage. And it really is product specific. You know, if you've got a determinate year hybrid that is driven, you know, the yield on the grain side is driven by population, probably going to need that same population to drive starch and tonnage with it that way. On the converse side, if we got something like a 5101 or that product I talked about earlier, that hybrid's got a full flex ear, it's going to like those more moderate, that 30 to 32,000 to perform better than it will at 36. So that's really hybrid dependent why I gave that range. But those are never intended to be taken to 38, 40, 42. Now, there might be a hybrid here or there that can handle that high a pop. But it's as a main kind of generalization on those products, 36,000 is kind of the top where I like to see them for corn silage. And then the silage first. This is one where I kind of give this range. I wouldn't take him over 34. Not that the agronomics won't handle it, but to get the quality that we're kind of claiming on the silage first stuff, we have to be at that 34,000 or less. So 32 to 34 is where most of those products are going to fall in the slot of having the best quality. Once you get with any hybrid, once you get past about 34, 35,000, you will gain tonnage, but those stalks will get smaller as we crowd that row or crowd those plants in that row, and we get a higher ratio of undigestible fiber, essentially the rind or the outside of that stalk to the inside of the pith. And once that ratio thins up, our fiber digestibility decreases drastically, our lignin content goes up, and at some point it's like feeding wood chips if you get too high. So we just got to make sure to keep those populations in that moderate range. Same thing I get out in the Dakotas, maybe those silage first, you know, if we take normal corn silage down to 26, 28, a silage first would be in that 26 range or below. Keeping that, letting those plants flex out. And in general, the silage first stuff mostly has flex ears or semi-flex ears where they'll handle those lower pops. Just kind of a function of genetics and that thing where it's kind of overlaying there. Okay, so this is one thing. So diving completely off the hybrid side, going into soil fertility type stuff now. So this is the biggest thing that I mean, in the last 2 to 3 weeks here, I knew it was the questions were going to be coming, and I know the other agronomists on the team and Steve and everybody else, we're dealing with these questions every day. And they're all good questions. It's just that this is something I really wanted to talk about. Everybody's talking about, where can I cut? Can I cut fertilizer? Can I cut this? Can I back off my rate of this by half? You know, how do I make the budget work, right? So the biggest thing I'll tell guys, they ask what's the one thing you can spend money on in 2026 and get a return on investment. And I will say this, the top 5 is all the same thing. It's soil test, soil test, soil test, soil test, and soil test. If you don't have recent soil tests on a farm, and I get the soil tests are a little bit of a cost, but for the money that it will either save you on over applying so you don't over apply fertilizer, or on the flip side, maybe it's, maybe we do grid sampling or something like that, and we reallocate those dollars, or we figure out those problem fields where we need the fertility to drive yield and not just blanket spread 100 pounds of DAP across the whole farm. Really, the soil test for the little bit of money that it takes, even just to do a basic composite sample, will save you a lot of money. And obviously, you go to a 5-acre grid or a 2.5-acre grid or a 1-acre grid, the cost of that sampling goes up, but you get a better picture of what's going on in that field. But excuse me. So the one thing is, everybody thinks of the fertility requirements for the crop this year. But a lot of people, when we're making that plan for this year, especially if we don't have recent soil tests, we forgot what happened the year before. So say, you know, and I know a lot of the Dakotas had pretty good yields last year, whether it be corn silage or on the grain side, Wisconsin, kind of really the whole upper Midwest. A lot of people had pretty decent rains overall last year. And what we often forget is with higher yields, we pull more fertility out of the soil bank. And this is one thing for guys doing corn silage, especially, that I think guys are going to miss the boat on this year, forget about, which could lead to decreased yields this year. So if you're fertilizing, and I kind of use 20 as a benchmark, I realize that out in the Dakotas somewhere that might be a stretch at 20 ton. In parts of Wisconsin, that's on the really, really low side. But I just for practical purposes, let's just use 20 for my napkin math here. So what happens, when we pull that 20 ton off, right? We generally pull off the fertility that we plan for 20 ton corn silage. The problem becomes when we pull off 26 ton, 34 ton, we planned on this and we got double what we thought we were going to have. That's a good day, right? We got a lot more than we planned on. Maybe we had to chop less acres to fill that pile or that bunk, whatever. But the problem is then we go back to next year and only plan on 20 ton corn silage again. And so I got some graphs here, and just stay with me as I go through this. I'm going to seem like I'm probably reaching here a little bit, but I'll bring it all back together here at the end, I promise. Okay, so 20 ton corn silage, just as a basic kind of picture, this is what we're removing per acre. So we're removing about 194 pounds of N, 62 pounds of phos, and 146 pounds of potassium, right? Normally not a big problem. We're taking taking a decent amount out of the profile. We're probably adding manure back in to offset that, whether it be that 5,000, 10,000 gallons liquid manure. However, usually that's, 20 tons, a lot of guys are safe on what they're putting back with manure. They can usually get most of that back. Maybe we have to add a little supplemental N at side dress time, those kind of things. But the fertility requirements pretty much we can get out of our manure program. So what happens when we go to 26 ton? So at 26 ton, we start pulling a lot more things. And the one thing I wanna show, so we're 250 pounds of nitrogen ballpark we pull out, which, to get higher tonnage, you got to get more nitrogen on corn. I mean, that's the number one driving nutrient. The big thing here is the P and the K. So when we pull the P2O5 or your phosphorus, and then we're pulling potassium at 190 pounds. So we're in another 70 pounds of of potassium come off with that extra 6 tons of corn silage. So if our goal was 20 ton, we've removed theoretically that much more K out of our profile. So if our soil test levels, and I'll get into that here in a little bit, if our soil test levels were at an optimum or maybe on the low side, and we were just flirting with that being just enough for the crop, and maybe we didn't spread last year, then we pulled off a huge crop last year, and now going into this year and we're looking at cutting fertility, that might not be the best thing that we could do, because it's all of a sudden you plant on 20 ton and then you're just relying on what's in the soil, and maybe now we only end up with 15. Well, then that's a problem. Then we got to chop essentially another 25% more acres to make up that difference. That can throw off rotations, throw off other things on the farm. So it just gets to be a big issue. So here's the real big one. So this is what a lot of guys in Wisconsin are dealing with, especially the further south you go. So what happens if we pull off monster corn silage yields, okay? What happens if we pull off 34 ton corn silage? So we had a lot of guys last year that, and it wasn't, widespread or anything, but we had a lot of fields in that 30 to 35 ton range, especially in southeast Minnesota, where we didn't get hit with southern rust and tar spot. But there was a lot of areas, and when this could be the same thing, maybe we're talking western South Dakota where we're pulling off 10 to 15 ton silage and we pulled off 25. It's all kind of relative here. But look at the potassium and the phosphorus requirements that we're pulling out of that profile. So granted, we want to take the blessing of the good crop and everything, but if we just get our blinders on and only focus our crop plan for this year on what we think is going to happen this year without looking back to last year, it can really get us in a bind. And I get that DAP's not cheap. But if you look at the ratio of how much potassium comes out versus the phos, and I'm not going to tell you to, this isn't Jake's statement to tell you to not spread DAP. But when push comes to shove and the checkbook says what the checkbook says, if you have to cut a nutrient out, I shouldn't say cut a nutrient out. If you're looking at where to spend the money just based on what the prices are and you feel comfortable where your profile is at on the phosphorus side, I would be sticking money into extra potassium. The reason being is potassium is the main driver to get nutrients up and down the plant, stalk integrity, stalk size and diameter, which helps with fiber digestibility. Just in that from 20 to 34 ton, granted, we didn't double the yield out of the output of the silage, right? 20 would be 40 ton if I doubled it, but we doubled the potassium we pulled out of there just with 14 ton corn silage. So it's not a direct correlation of, that each ton you just go up so much. The higher that yield index level, the potassium requirement climbs away, if that makes sense. So we're getting that bigger gap there. So and that's the same thing. I'm not going to tell you to cut DAP. I said that before. But that's, or any, whatever your phosphorus source is, but maybe reallocate those dollars. If a guy's saying, I'm only going to put on one nutrient, I only got the money to do one thing this year, what is it? For the price of what potash is right now, and maybe, some soils out in the Dakotas are higher in potassium and we have a phos issue. Maybe this isn't the time to do that, but like in the state of Wisconsin, potassium is the nutrient that would not hurt to over apply, especially if you know that you pulled off big yields the last year or even 2 years. So this is just kind of a little graph here. So this is all stuff. If you go on the University of Wisconsin webpage, sorry, I didn't use University of Minnesota or NDSU or SDSU because I refuse to say go Jacks or go Bison or whatever they say in North Dakota. But no, I'm just kidding aside. So University of Wisconsin just updated this. They did a huge fertility management study. And I think the data, no matter where we are at, is pretty concrete. And it's very interesting. So I thought I'd kind of present this to the group here because it's very pertinent to what I'm talking about. So this is just a simple graph, and this isn't part of their study, but it just kind of shows that, like when you start on phosphorus side, it's just kind of a visual, so like starts at very high, optimum low, and very low. So that's what would come back on your soil test. So then it shows the probability of a yield increase if commercial fertilizer is applied. So DAP, MAP, any other phosphorus, 1034O, any of those types of things. So if we're sitting at an optimum level, and this is where I see a lot of guys, and I actually had this come up last week. A customer was wondering, like I'm at optimum fertility levels on my phos side. He's like, but I just always put 100 pounds of DAP on because it's my comfortability thing and I don't want to run short. Looking at that, if I'm at an optimum level, and there's a range here, which the state of Wisconsin dials that number exactly right into what it is through a lot of different data here. But it's only a 30 to 60% chance that I'm going to get my return on investment, or I shouldn't say return on investment, a yield increase. Okay. So not even return on investment. So like if I'm at a 30%, I'm at optimum, I'm going to go apply phosphorus fertilizer. There's only a 30% chance on the low side that I'm actually going to see a yield increase. That yield increase could be a half a bushel. So that's where, obviously, and I know guys aren't just going to go out and spread DAP where they don't need to this year because nobody's that crazy. But just to kind of look at where you're at and where, like, we get down in that very low range, a lot of guys are in that low to very low. A lot of our soils just in the upper Midwest generally are not high in phos unless we're history of a lot of manure. A lot of guys are pulling the synthetic fertilizer portion out on those acres. Maybe it's acres we can't get manure back on. And at that point, that's one of the worst things that you could do. And that's where I'm saying soil testing and really figuring out where we need to add that nutrient versus just blanket spreading everything, going to the co-op and doing the same thing we've done the last 20 years. We really can't do that this year. Okay, so this is the interesting thing. So I took these snippets off a presentation that was online. If anybody wants the link to, there's a whole host of videos on this that are about 2 hours long, but this is my 5-minute recap. If you guys want that link, I can definitely get that to you. Shoot me a text, call, whatever, and I can text you that link on what this is. So they did this big study, multiple farms all across the state over the last 2 years. And so what they did is they essentially found the probability of response to P and K application based on your soil test levels. Okay, so very low is VL, low, optimum, high, and then extremely high. Okay. So when you look at this, and this is where the graph, and everybody always asks, well, what nutrient, do I cut out, or where do I reallocate dollars to my budget? This is where my method to my madness is on that phosphorus side. So if you look at that probability, and that very low is 91% that we're going to get a response. an economical response, 79% if we're at low. If we're at an optimum, and that's where they gave that range of 30 to 60%, it's only a 44% chance that we're going to get an economic response to a phosphorus application if we are at an optimum level. And then they have high and then extremely high. So obviously, if we're in the high to extremely high, the DNR on the dairy side and even some of the feedlot, they're not letting you guys spread any more phosphorus out there. So it's not real likely that we're spreading phos. But even to be in an excessively high situation, we only have to be at like 110 parts per million to get you in that range. So I mean, that's a high phos number, but I got guys that are in the 400 to 500 range, which is extremely high. But that's, nobody's applying. But if you look in that, there's a lot of soils that are flirting on that low to optimum, and that's kind of where guys are trying to make that decision. Then look at the graph on potassium on the right, so the pink bars. So 91% in the very low, so tracks right with phos, 76% on the low. And then look what happens when we get into that optimum and high. So when we get on an optimum, there's a 51% chance. So it's a greater chance on at optimum levels with potassium. And then look at the high level. So this is where looking at, like, if we know we were high in potassium last year and we ripped a huge yield thing off, and guys are like, well, I'm still probably at optimum level or whatever. Look at the percent chance that you can still gain yield by having enough potassium on that acre. If we're, or maybe we were at optimum, we slid back to low, but we don't know it yet because we haven't resoil tested. Look at that difference of, the 76% positive response there. It's high, but we could have had so much more yield because obviously the percentage chance goes down. We could have had more yield if we would have been at optimum level, essentially. So it is kind of a fine line on the potassium side. But if I was going to spend not extra money on fertility, but if I was going to cut something out and or buy a nutrient and potassium doesn't move in the soil profile. So once you've applied it, that's kind of like a savings account. It's always there. So guys that are, where if they own land or they have long-term rents, potassium is that one nutrient that when you apply it, it's not going anywhere. So it's kind of call it money in the bank. And potassium is still a decent buy right now too. So now we're talking silage, we're talking everything, and Jake's talking commercial fertilizer. So I'm kind of ping-ponging here, and I apologize. But really think about this, especially if we're on a dairy or feedlot or whatever, any aspect of corn silage, we have manure somewhere. That's where you really got to think on the manure side of where to go with stuff or how to use that manure to your advantage to get the levels of what you need where you need it. So this is just this is the Baldwin YMS trial from last year. So this is our knowledge plot data. So I just kind of want to highlight a couple different biologicals and just kind of what, how they change corn silage and explain what they're doing. So this is just, kind of added on benefits or added on products that we can add to a silage program to kind of help boost the yield side and also the quality side. So last year at Baldwin, we had a 5-point-ton acre increase on tonnage increase on 94-95 at Baldwin with Fortress. So Fortress is the stress mitigator and herbicide metabolism product based with amino acids that we carry. So we also increased starch content by 3.1%. So pretty good starch jump there. That's coming from the grain yield side. Now, I'm not going to tell you that every single time we're going to gain 5.8 ton with Fortress. Baldwin was kind of a one-off scenario last year. That was sprayed at 55 degrees with a full rate of Resicor. And then it didn't get warm for 2 weeks. So it was the perfect scenario for Fortress to work when that corn plant was essentially dying from the Resicor application because it could not metabolize the herbicide. Fortress gave it essentially that steroid shot it needed to metabolize that herbicide and keep growing. So that's on looking through all the YMS data and everything we have, the Fortress did help increase tonnage overall. But this is kind of just the one data set I wanted to hone in because I thought it was kind of cool because each individual product changed things the way that I have seen them change, corn silage, whether it be through the starch or whatever. It's been consistent year over year here. So The NutriQuire side, starch content increase of 3.7. That's coming just from obviously the yield side. I don't have the exact yield numbers. I want to say at Baldwin this year, NutriQuire was 13 bushel. So if you do the back math, and I'm not about to do that on here, but it actually ends up being about on a 25-ton corn silage, it ends up being ballpark that. So kind of nice to see those two things overlay. TS601, so that's our biofungicide. This is one that was kind of interesting to me. So a 3.1% increase in NDFD30. And everybody's like, Jake, how does a fungicide increase fiber digestibility or a biofungicide? The thing is, last year, Baldwin, we had northern corn leaf blight, tar spot, southern rust, anthracnose, and crown rot, all in that plot. It was like a buffet of essentially to the leaf diseases on 94-95. And 94-95 is average on northern corn leaf blight. But with all the stresses that we had last year, and it was rampant in western Wisconsin where I live, we had disease problems everywhere. The thing is, once that plant dies from disease and all that leaf material dies from disease, that all becomes undigestible fiber that gets woody, very lignified. That dead tissue is not digestible. So showing, and I know the guys from the YMS team, I had them at Baldwin, a fair amount of dealers, some customers, some account managers that are on this call came and saw that trial. Ray Charles could have seen the difference in the northern corn leaf blight between TS601 and the check. It was unbelievable. And that directly shows when we look at the fiber digestibility side, we gained that NDFD30 or how much the fiber is digestible at the 30-hour mark. That was, and a 3.1% increase, that is huge. 3.1% doesn't sound like a lot. On fiber digestibility, that's a big increase in milk per ton. So, and then the other thing is, so we saw the increase in the digestible, and then the UNDF 240, we actually dropped by 0.9 of a point, which is just a direct correlation of that exact same thing. So, the emphasis foliar, we saw a starch increase of 6.7%. We had a lot of nitrogen loss at Baldwin. Emphasis was one of our biggest, I would say probably biggest products at Baldwin this year on the yield piece. I don't know the exact number, but it was huge this year. It's on a sandy loam, silt loam soil texture, not a lot of topsoil, and it's sugar, sand, and gravel beneath. We had a lot of rain, especially later on in the season, lost a lot of nitrogen, and so emphasis foliar really kind of popped. The other one that kind of shocked me, and I don't think it's going to happen every year, but it did decrease the UNDF 240 by 2.1%. So that was kind of interesting to see. But that starch content of that 6 points is a little high in a normal scenario. But every single year that we've tested emphasis or the Invita product, we haven't always posted the silage data on that. That's going to change going forward in the future. That's going to be part of the whole yield booklet when we go out at the end of the year with trial data. But the emphasis, we're actually able to increase the starch. Most years it tends to be that 3 to 4%. Baldwin this year is a little bit excessively high. And then the NutriQuire Terrasim starch content increase of 5%. That's just coming on the grain side. I haven't really seen the NutriQuire Terrasim or the planter box products really change the fiber digestibility side so much. They're changing the energy, and that's all basically coming from the grain yield side of things. So just kind of some of the products that we carry that can help you kind of increase the quality of what you're already doing. Okay, so this is I think one of the last things I have. So the other thing, so everybody's like, why are we talking harvest moisture, Jake? It's March and we're not even planted yet. This is the one thing I think that if I see guys make a mistake on one thing on silage is we go out and it gets to be Labor Day weekend. Everybody wants to go to the cabin or do whatever, take some time off. And then we get back and we're like, oh, we got at least a week till corn silage. And this has happened the last 3 years. And then they go out and they test their corn silage and they're like, holy crap, it's 63%. I got 1,000 acres to chop. The harvest moisture is extremely, extremely important to quality. So there's an inverse relationship with moisture and quality. So as moisture of silage decreases, so if we go from 70 to 69, 68, 67, 66, and on down the list, our starch content rises because the grain is maturing more and more. So we get more starch content, but we lose fiber digestibility every single day. When you harvest silage that's too wet, you're giving up starch content. So if we're chopping at like 72, 73, and we got juice running out of the bag or out of the pile, you get that nice green kind of stenchy liquid. There's, guys got to cover acres. And I know a lot of guys start at more than 70 just to get going. But that's what your trade-off is when you harvest too wet. On the dry side, you're giving up major fiber digestibility and then just overall forage quality. Your lignin numbers go up, your UNDFs go up, your NDFT goes down. So exactly the three things you don't want. And that really starts to tail off once you get below 65%. And I get, if guys still got silos around and everything, or they want to chop at 60, or even some of the silo guys, even a little drier, little bit different deal if we have to put the forage up that dry because of the storage system we have. But generally, most guys that move to bags or bunks, 68% is the target. I don't care if we're feeding black cattle in North Dakota or if I'm feeding, cattle, Brahma cattle in Florida. 68% is the target moisture for silage. And that's, if you look at the bottom here, so this is an experimental that you guys are going to come to know as a commercial number called 6P910. So it was an experimental 25-10-59. So tested pretty consistent in corn silage overall last year from sample to sample to sample. And that's the thing is when we send these in, we don't really see a lot of variance in samples on the genetic side. You might pick up a point or two in fiber at one location or another, but unless like we harvest something 20 points less of moisture, which is what happened here, or we have something else, we really don't see that. But just to show you the difference in what happens, and this is an extreme case, but I just kind of wanted to show it, and I blame Steve Ressler for this a little bit. That's a side story, but so West B, Wisconsin, we had that EXP 25-10-59, harvested at ideal moisture 68.4, 36-ton corn silage, fiber digestibility 53.85, which in the realm of corn silage is not the best, but last year fiber digestibilities were 4 to 5 points lower in the whole entire upper Midwest from what they were the year before. So that's actually a pretty decent score for last year. A UNDF of a 9.26, which is very good. You can see the sugars there. The starch is 37, 36.92 for milk per ton. So very good corn silage, good quality, great product. Then what happens if the wheels fall off the bus? So we had a plot where in Owatonna where it was harvested at 47% moisture. Now this was a one-off scenario. We had a frost. It was the last thing that the guy kind of took off, and so things got really dry. If you look at that though, so don't focus on the tonnage. That's mainly a function of management and location, those kind of things. Look at the fiber digestibility. So we lost 4 points in fiber by letting it get that dry. The UNDF went way up. Starch content went obviously a little up, but that starch content of 2% does not offset a 4-point drop in fiber and a 2.5% increase in that UNDF. So look at that. The milk per ton dropped essentially 500 pounds of milk per ton. So if we're pulling off 25-ton corn silage, take that times 500 pounds of milk per ton, then divided by the current milk price, which I know milk price is not great right now. That's a lot of money. And I'm using hypotheticals here of what would happen even if this was and there's a law of like going on the downside, like if we had chopped at 42 or 40%, like it's only going to get so bad and that curve kind of flattens off towards the bottom. But you would have seen similar numbers if we would have harvested at 55%, that the quality numbers would have been roughly the same as if it was at that 47% moisture that it was at. So just know that that's the one thing that, doesn't really, and I get that weather can affect things, whether it gets, we get super, super dry and bake at the end like we did a couple years ago, or say field conditions get too wet, we can't get in there. I realize Mother Nature changes things, but this is one of the things that we can control. And that simple little decision to harvest things at the exact right moisture, I call it find a hitch pin. If we can get things done right exactly at time, that's the number one thing that doesn't cost us really any extra money that can really influence the quality of feed that we're putting up. So just a couple products on the silage side that I want to talk on, just kind of more in depth. But the Nutrify is a manure treatment product. So it's a biological, goes in the manure pits, helps with crusting, helps essentially get the nutrients more even in that pit, has a nitrogen kind of inhibiting bacteria that keeps ammonia into ammonium form and keeps it from volatilizing off in the pit and keeps it in your manure. So this is a product if guys are looking, on the silage side, if we have pits or anything like that, as long as we're not daily hauling, that we can use in that pit to capture essentially some fertility and get it back out on that field to save some dollars on the fertility side. That also can be used as a stock residue breakdown to help recycle those nutrients, like that P and K I was talking about, recycle that back into the soil. The other thing, and I actually just learned about this a couple weeks ago, if we are trying to drop phosphorus levels in the soil, so the inverse of what I was talking about with where do I put the fertility, if I have too much of it, you can really load the soil up with Nutrify and spray it on at a higher rate and actually help to reduce phos levels within that profile. On like a Bray 1 test. So if you got the DNR breathing down your neck or the Fish and Wildlife Service, those kind of things, the Nutrify product can really be one that can help you out in those scenarios. And then we have NutriQuire. So NutriQuire is a sister product to Nutrify. So this would be an in-furrow foliar pre-emerge treatment that we can use to essentially make our phosphorus more available. So maybe we're in those scenarios where we have that very low to low phos level. This product, those bacteria will go into the profile and free up the phos that's tied up, whether it be an aluminum phosphate, iron phosphate, calcium phosphate, which would be in your low situations would be the iron and the aluminum. High pH would be your calcium. Goes in, breaks those bonds, and makes that phosphorus available. Also can make phosphorus available that doesn't show up on a regular simple soil test like it would show up on a Bray 2 test. It makes that phosphorus available to the plant, so we can maybe, if we're at an optimum level and you're like, man, where do I cut? You don't want to go out and bulk spread 100 pounds of DAP. NutriQuire is a product that you can add in to get more out of what you already have in that profile. Now, it's not going to give you, like if you're looking at, hey, I'll just take DAP out and put NutriQuire in, it's not going to give you necessarily that 13 bushel yield bump that's in our yield data booklet every single time if we're cutting the DAP out other than our standard practice. But if you can save $30 an acre out of spreading DAP or 40 or 20, whatever that number is, spend the 13 on the NutriQuire and save money to get the exact same yields that you would. That's the way we use NutriQuire when we're looking at not applying nutrients, but it's not a double dip product. You don't get to cut fertility, add this in, and get a yield increase above and beyond what your standard practice used to be. So just keep that in mind. But NutriQuire is a product that's really been growing for us. It's probably been the biggest buzzword on the phosphorus side. And like I said, on corn silage, it's been a huge increase on the starch side. I have seen personally big increases on tonnage with NutriQuire. That one example I showed you in Baldwin is probably the only sample we had last year that didn't increase tonnage. 2 years ago, it was drastic. So NutriQuire has been one that on corn silage for tonnage has really been a driver for us over the last few years. And then Rhizostack Repel, just this is for the corn silage guys that are continually using, whether we're using Smart Stacks or Smart Stacks Pro or Vorseed or Duracade, name your rootworm trait. So Rhizostack Repel is a product that goes in the planter box, keeps essentially the rootworm larva from getting to the root system through producing jasmonic acid. Keeps them away from the roots. A lot of guys say, well, I'm already running traded corn. I don't need to worry about stuff. They all still have to take a bite, no matter the trait. I don't care how good the trait is or how good it's advertised. They all still have to eat to essentially to die. So if we have 1 million of them out there versus if we have 1,000 of them feeding on that root system, the 1 million of them are going to blow right through that trait. Doesn't matter what trait it is because they're all taking a bite of that root system versus that minimalized number. So it's a product that's kind of often overlooked. There is a yield increase with the Rhizostack component as well. And then the Rhizostack, when we do have some rootworm feeding where we do have roots pruned off, the Rhizostack will actually get the roots to go up to the next node and regenerate. So we have a root system normally where we'd have nothing, and keeps that root kind of white, vibrant, and healthy instead of dying off and rotting back to the root crown, causing crown rot, anthracnose, those kind of things. So this is a product that you can use. The Rhizostack would be what's also the base of that is what's in our NutriQuire Terrasim that increases starch content. So you can get that benefit out of it and also get the protection. The other thing we forget about is all rootworm traits on the market have 5% structured refuge. This is my biggest thing that I like about this product is we're EPA mandated to have that refuge in the bag. Well, a lot of times if you've walked enough corn and you look at the refuge component, it doesn't matter the company, the brand, the trait. A lot of times those refuge plants don't quite look as good as the regulars. Where we have a little nubby ear on there and they just, maybe the vigor's not quite there, those kind of things where you're like, yep, that's a refuge plant. If I can, and oftentimes the reason it looks like that, especially corn on corn, you'll see this more often, is because they're getting absolutely annihilated by rootworm. Well, if I can protect that plant so it can produce some kind of economical yield versus a little nub and ear with 3 kernels on it, and you guys have all seen this. If I have a 160 acre field, and I'll use some extremes here, but if I have a 5 acre drowned out in 160 acres and I have 200 bushels of corn, what does that 5 acre drowned out do to the overall yield number of that field? It drops it way more significantly than people think it does. So if you think about that 5%, you know, if I have 5% of the plants out there, if I can even raise them up to a 50 or 100 bushel average, those 5% of plants, that's going to help increase my overall field average, if you will, whether we're talking tonnage or on the grain side. So that's where I think Rise, Stack, Repel, especially in the dairy side or even the feedlot side where we're dealing with a lot of intensive corn on corn for silage, Rise, Stack, Repel has a great fit too. So thanks everybody. If anybody's got any other questions or whatever, feel free to text me 715-441-2579 or call, email, whatever. I'm happy to help. So thanks everybody.